Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, lovely people. This is Marie Alessi with yet another Up Spiral Brief interview. And today, I finally, drumroll please, have Daniel Sih with us. I was so looking forward to having this conversation. If you remember, we had to swap the interview, Daniel versus Daniel, a few weeks ago because Daniel was sick. So I'm really, really excited to have you here. And we just had a quick pre-chat before we went live. How perfect the timing actually is that we're doing this today, because the topic of this week is Father's Day. Here in Australia, we've got Father's Day coming up on Sunday, and you have such a beautiful, very, very touching story to share, Daniel. And before I get you to introduce yourself, I just want to quickly share. Daniel actually heard me speak on another podcast and then was really touched by my story and reached out to me, and we connected, and now we're live here. I was so looking forward to introducing Daniel to you. So without further ado, would you do us the honor and introduce yourself to our audience, please? Welcome.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me on this podcast, Marie. It's great to finally catch up with you in this way. So I mean, in terms of my background, I have 3 kids. I'm married. I've been married 20 years to Kylie, and I live in Tasmania, Hobart. And yeah, so a lot of my in terms of what I do for work, I run a productivity coaching firm. I'm an author, a speaker. So I think we've been on similar podcasts a few times, which has been interesting.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, our paths have crossed many times without actually, doing this live here. So I was so drawn to your story, Daniel, because this is nothing that you hear every day, and I thought it was really, really heartwarming what you did with what was presented to you. But I don't want to tell your story. I'm going to get you to maybe share a little bit about why we're actually here today, what made us want to share the story with our movement here. This is really beautiful. I'm going to hand this back to you because your story is just very, very personal. So I'll get you to share whatever you are comfortable with sharing with our audience here.
Yeah, no, thank you. So, I mean, I'm obviously speaking with you because I have a story of grief and loss, but, life after loss as well. And, unlike many of the people who speak, I think on your podcast, I'm thankful it wasn't my direct family member, but I lost a very, very dear friend who I've done more than a decade of life with, a guy called Michael, or Mick, I'll probably call him. And so I might share some of how I know Mick, but he died very suddenly of a heart attack. Nearly a year today. It was only a few days ago we had his 1-year anniversary.
Wow.
And he was a very special person in my life, more like a second father and a brother. And I actually live physically in community with him, sharing land with his family and his kids. And so his death has very much impacted our lives, our kids' lives, and obviously his life has impacted us as well. And so, part of that story will be my story and his story together.
Yeah. And can you share a little bit about what that means, like living in community? How much share a little bit about that community, how that looked in reality, in day-to-day life?
Yeah, look, I might even go back to when I met him, because it's probably a good idea to explain how I met him, and then how I actually started to live next door to him and share land and life and community. So so I came to Tassie, or Hobart, so nearly 15 years ago now, and he was actually almost the first person I met. We came and partly we were connecting with a church community here, and he was part of that community. And so a group of people from that community basically had us over for wine and cheese when we first arrived. And so he was he was actually sharing a house. Him and his wife and their baby were sharing a house with another couple at the time in a large rental. And I remember the very first time we met, we actually got along like a house on fire. It's funny, I say that, when my wife and I met each other, it definitely wasn't love at first sight, but Mick and I got along well straight away. And I love it. And I remember, for some reason, he ended up pretending to speak Norwegian, although he didn't speak Norwegian, and I started pretending to speak Norwegian. And his flatmate who lived with him, I remember him saying, "Oh no, there's another one who's like him, dad jokes and everything else." So, but the heartbeat that we had a very similar heart, we realized, for shared living and community life. I lived in Vanuatu for a small amount of time, 10 years before that. And I lived in a village, and I remember asking one of the leaders of the village, you know, what do you find strange about Australia? Because he was the only one who spoke English, and he was the only one who traveled overseas. And he said, in Australia, you have these small little fences around your houses. And I don't know why you do that. Like, they don't stop anyone from stealing anything. It's almost like you're just so scared of everyone that you have to protect your land and your stuff. And that doesn't make sense, because in Vanuatu, everyone shared everything, and they actually were a community.
Wow.
And I remember coming home. So I was a 19-year-old, and I remember thinking, actually, that is crazy that we, you know, metaphorically have fences around our lives, and we don't share life with each other, and we live so individualized and so isolated from each other. And I wanted to live differently than that. And so when I met Mick, you know, years later, they were living in community.
Love this. I really love this, especially when you said Vanuatu, because Rob and I went there on a honeymoon, so I really got a very special place in my heart for that beautiful island. Yeah,
it's a beautiful, and the language is just it's beautiful as well. Anyway, I have many beautiful memories of Vanuatu. So look, I met Mick, and they'd lived in community, and for the 10 years before, you know, for the few years before, my wife and I had flatmated with others, because we wanted to try to have a bit more of an intersection of life. But and so we started to dream about, well, how might we actually create a life with less fences, and create spaces where we could know our neighbours, where we could have an open house and an open fridge and an open table, and do it together, but not in a, I don't mean this in a negative way, but not like a hippie commune type way, you know, because we're working professionals. I was a physiotherapist, he was an architect, and you know, Julia, his wife, is a sociologist, my wife's a nurse, so we're middle class, we're Aussies, but we also wanted to intersect a lot more. So we kind of started to dream about what it could look like together, and eventually we bought land, and he designed, he's an architect, a brilliant architect, so we designed 2 houses.
How handy.
I know, very handy. And we ended up going on a journey, and we ended up building 2 houses together, and shared a loan, and then split the loan, and, you know, went on probably a 2-year journey to actually build 2 houses without any fences, where we have a shared land between our houses. We have a shared barbecue deck, shared gardens, shared chickens, shared trampoline.
Shared chickens, I love it.
Although now,
what did the chicken say about that?
Well, I'm annoyed with Mick, because we used to share the chickens 1 month on, 1 month off, and now I have to do it every month. So that's the one thing. I know I'm not very happy.
Not
with him
about the rest
that.
of everything. It's just you leave me with those chickens.
It's probably the chickens that are the biggest thing I'm annoyed about. You know, how come I have to keep doing the chickens, Mick?
Yeah.
But anyway, and then we had 6 kids between us. I have 3, they have 3, you know, so we've done a lot of life. And so really for 10 years leading up to his death, or more than that, nearly 12 years, we ate dinner at least weekly together as families.
That's beautiful.
We take each other's kids to school and drop them off, and I've also created a life where we have probably about 20 people who eat with us regularly from the neighborhood or from different parts of our lives. And so he's a very special person in my life.
I really love that. It's so touching for me, because, you know, we just in our quick pre-chat that we had before we went live, we talk about how important community really is, you know, and I always say, you don't heal well in isolation, and you have created that before there was actually something to heal, which is so beautiful. You know, you have created this community which probably gave you a lot more people and a lot more energy and love to hold everyone when it actually happened, you know. And often people don't have that. People need to create that. It's my shout out to everyone listening here, you know, create that community. We all need it. And looking at what we have created here in Loving Life After Loss, that's a really beautiful, very large community of people who are all here to hold space for each other and to support each other and not to judge. And that is so, so beautiful. So may I ask, how did your kids go with all of that? Because you said you had 6 kids between the 2 of you. You don't say he had 3 kids and I had 3 kids. You said we had 6 kids between the 2 families. And I think that's so beautiful. It just shows how deeply you truly lived community, how connected you really were and still are now with Julia is his wife. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that. How did the kids go? And then I'd like to talk about how everybody dealt with the actual adversity afterwards. But let's start with the kids first. How did they grow up? Did they feel like having 6 siblings, or how did that feel like for them?
Oh yes, they definitely fight like siblings. So Mick and Jules have 3 girls. We have a girl and 2 boys. And yeah, look, they've definitely grown up. Obviously, we have separate families, but there's you know, really they're also family, and they treat us that way, and vice versa. In terms of the kids, I mean, when they were young, we set up an intercom system between our houses. And
I
so,
love it.
so my wife and I could go on a date because Julia and Mick were listening out for our kids if they cried or if they woke up, and our kids trusted that
That's
they were close
awesome.
enough, and vice versa. So there was that benefit of
That's
community where it's so
beautiful.
hard to
Yeah.
get at babysitting or to go out if you've got young kids.
Yeah.
You know, the kids obviously, you know, we just did a lot of life together, and
Mm.
I mean, there were definitely challenges as well. There was, you know, I liken community a bit like a marriage in the sense that we definitely had like a 7-year itch, and we had some really challenging experiences with some neighbours, and it created a clash between, particularly around our kids. There was a person we didn't feel we wanted our children to be around, and yet our neighbours felt comfortable, and so it created a lot of tension. And so we've had to also work through struggle and disagreement and fights. There was one point where we needed our friends to come in and help us almost mediate our way through, and that was a really important thing. But our kids have seen all of that, you know, and I remember one point when my boy said, "Who's coming to dinner tonight?" He was about 6 years old, and we said, "Oh, no one." And he started to cry, and I'm like, "What's wrong?" He's like, "Oh, I want something to dinner." And it was a real like a heart moment for me, because I'm like, I never would have, like, his experience is so shaped by being around other families and intersecting in other people's lives that was normal. And whereas when I grew up, it's not that we were isolated, but someone to
It
come
wasn't
in
so
for
normal to
dinner
have
was,
guests and people over the entire time.
yeah. And so I really liked that they had that experience of life together, and they always had someone to go with, someone to play with, someone to fight with, someone to spend time with. And yeah, and Mick is, you know, was definitely a second father, and he has attributes that I just could not give my kids. You know, he took them fishing, and he has this wonder for spiders and this wonder for life. He really knew how to wonder at beauty. I think that was the architect and musician and artist in him. And I'm not like that at all. I'm a project manager, a productivity consultant, you know. So and so he brought in that kind of aspect into my kids' lives, and Julia brought in other things as well. And so I feel like they've had a more rounded parenting than I could have given them myself, if that makes sense.
And vice versa, probably. You know, it's really beautiful to honor both sides. I love the way you speak about him, and I love what you have created, and mostly that you so openly share about, you know, there were ups and downs, and you found your ways to work through that. I think this is the most beautiful example that you can give your kids, to actually teach them how you work through things like that, because life is not always perfect and rosy. There are ups and downs, and there are different opinions, and to teach kids how to actually work through that, I think that's really absolutely beautiful. It's such a life lesson. And with that being said, can you share a little bit, you know, what happened when Mick passed, and how did you hear about it? How did that affect you in terms of your community living as well?
Yeah, so look, he was a healthy man, so none of us are unhealthy people, so it was a complete surprise, which I think is similar to your story. And yeah, look, basically Mimi, who was their middle child, just madly knocked on our door one evening, and we thought it was actually a drunk neighbor. And so I slowly came up, you know, I'm like, oh, this is a drunk person. We do have people around us who often need our help. But look, obviously it was Mimi, and it was like, oh, something's wrong. So Mick had collapsed, and we went down. So my wife and I are CPR trained, and he was unconscious. So we we went about resuscitating him. My wife's a nurse and I used to be a physiotherapist. So and Julia obviously called the ambulance, had called the ambulance. So we resuscitated him for about 10 minutes before the paramedics came. I won't go into all the story, but basically they couldn't revive him, and that was really hard. And the interesting thing about, you talk about, you mentioned the beauty of being in community and having those shared rhythms and patterns, or the shared life we have, and that has been an amazing thing to help us. But it also, I think, in some ways amplified our loss, because there was a community of people around us who saw Mick as a spiritual parent, and I, the next day, it was my responsibility to start calling people. And probably the hardest thing out of that whole time that I remember wasn't so much resuscitating Mick, or or bringing the kids in and telling them and all that kind of stuff. That was a horrible experience. But
I can only imagine.
It was but it was calling a friend who he was like a dad, another person he was like a dad to, and telling them, and they just fell on the ground. And it was actually the hardest memory I have of that time, having to tell people who love him deeply that he'd gone. And I'm so grateful that I got to be part of that journey of him dying, actually, because it made it more tangible. But there are others who he was there and then he was gone, and that was actually harder than what I think I experienced.
I can so relate to what you're saying. I was not part of that journey when Rob died. He was away on a business trip, and I got the phone call. Yet I was there when his dad passed away, and I was there the entire time. I was able to hold him and sit with him and hold my boys when they were there. They made a very conscious choice of wanting to be there. I gave them multiple options to not have to watch this if it was too hard for them, but they wanted to be there. And he died, peacefully with his family, holding him in love, which was beautiful. So obviously, everybody's journey and everybody's way of passing is so different. And I think I have learned the blessing of being there and being able to hold space for somebody, which I really saw as a gift. So I can really relate to what you're saying. Being part of it makes it more tangible, makes it easier to understand in a way. What were the age range of your kids at that time when Mick passed?
So Aja, their child. Aja is, I think she was 16. And then Naomi was 14, who's my oldest girl. Mimi was then, I think, 13, which is their girl. My boy is 12, their girl is 12, and then mine is 10. So they were all in my house, and Julia's family were with the kids while we were resussing, and they were praying and talking, and then eventually, we got them all to come down. And I do remember it was really quite beautiful. I mean, it was traumatic and terrible, but Mick and Jules sing this prayer over the kids every day when they go to sleep, and they've done it their whole life. And so we all sang that prayer.
Wow.
As the two families, and that was really special. And hard, but we probably spent an hour there singing and just praying. And,
that is so beautiful.
Being with
really
him
beautiful.
And the kids.
That's really touching. And I think it's the most beautiful thing when you have that chance to say your goodbye there, and not, the body's not there or is taken away from you. It's just so I think we do need this a lot more, to be allowed to stay with the body, to be able to say goodbye, and to have community around you singing a prayer over you. This is so touching for me to hear that. It's really beautiful and confronting and sad, but beautiful at the same time. So I really want to thank you for sharing that. How did that affect your community life afterwards? Did you feel that there was a lot more, I have to say it up front if that's okay, was there a lot more strain, expectation, responsibility then on your behalf, or was that evened out between the three of you? How did you feel, if you don't mind me asking that, because it is quite intense, when one male gets taken out of the two couples, there's always a very different dynamic, obviously. How did that affect your community living?
Yeah. So look, I would definitely say for the first 3-4 months, I felt an enormous burden of responsibility. I'm also so I'm not now, I've finished, but I was also a pastor at the time, and I was the church pastor as well. So I led the funeral. And so I had a whole community around me that I was kind of leading spiritually, but I was also not coping myself, obviously, and needed to grieve. And I ended up having going away for I'll go back to your question, but I was meant to head away on a 6-month sabbatical, which I'd planned for 3 years, and I was almost burnt out at the time, and I was meant to leave the week after, so it was terrible timing. And part of that sabbatical was to have a 6-week silent retreat just by myself to kind of work out where I was heading in life. And so that clearly changed. And I still had 3 weeks of silence, and then 3 weeks of silence and a funeral, and all this stuff. But why did I say that? So there was a whole lot of emotional grieving, shifting, changing for me. But we also had an incredible response in terms of people supporting and encouraging us as well, actually.
That's beautiful.
So on the one hand, we've had to do a lot of, we've given a lot, but we've also had an incredible amount of support from people. And when people support Jules and the girls, they also help us. So, friend Tom provides firewood for Jules, and so I don't have to do that, and we've had people come and I still do the chickens by myself, but we've had people help, with shed moving and clearing.
No volunteers for the chickens.
No volunteers for the chickens. But but I've definitely, absolutely, it's increased our responsibility. And the sad thing, I think, is we've lost Mick, and all his gifts and skills and his passion for life. Our life is not as fun and joyful as it was before he passed away. Not just my life, but our church community as well. We lost a lot from him, but also, and Julia is obviously grieving deeply, and she's not able to be the person, with the capacity that she would. She was the spiritual mum of the community, and so now she's grieving, and she's working, loving her kids, and so I suppose our relationship has shifted in the sense of what she can do. And we've all lost we've reduced our capacity in many ways in terms of how much we can open our home to others outside of ourselves.
That's beautiful, though, that you have that awareness and that you actually act upon it. So many people fall into this doing it anyway, and then they feel really overwhelmed, like literally overwhelmed by either too much presence or the wrong presence sometimes, even in their homes. So I love that you're so aware of that and you act upon that.
It's a season of being slow and. Well, I'm not slow in my work life. That's been the opposite, but it's we're slow in terms of we've just given ourselves the permission not to, eat with 20 people in our house each week anymore. Now it's just our families, the two families together, and people understand that, and it's a season. But at the same time, we have this, because we had the rhythms in place. And we had the rhythms, eating and praying and taking the kids out and having fire pits, we had those patterns in place anyway. They've continued. And, I asked Julia, is there anything she would want to say on something like this? And she did say that it has been incredible to have a community and to have the patterns in place. Even things she said, like, I think I would have felt quite fearful, actually, just unsafe without Mick being by myself where we live. And we've actually got a fairly dangerous neighborhood in some ways. There are often police around, and there have been murders and things like that. And but because I'm next door, particularly me, I suppose, but Kai as well, she's not unsafe. And also we just have these patterns and we continue. So as much as we're all grieving together, we're not grieving alone. And that's been really beautiful and really valuable for kids as well as for us together.
Yeah. I have to say, I love this so much that you say that, because that community aspect, again, it's really something. And I love that Julia mentioned that as an example, the feeling safe, because I often address a healing journey when people ask me, where do I even start? I often start with the question, can you separate who you have lost from what you have lost? Like, what is it that you're actually missing the most? And for me, that was, the feeling safe. That was exactly that example as well. I thought with Rob around, I always felt safe. I always, like, he was my knight in shining armor. I always felt protected. There was not even a question around safety when Rob was with me, no matter where, no matter what. And I was always very aware of that, very consciously aware of that. I bathed in it, if that makes sense. I really loved it, how safe I felt when I walked with him. And so that was the first thing I addressed when Rob died. I made sure that the front and back door was locked before we went to bed. I made sure that the blinds were down, because all our surroundings are glass doors in our house, so I made sure the blinds were down so I didn't feel watched in any way or whatever. I made sure that I pushed my bed in one corner so I felt more cradled in and safer that way. So I did all these little things, and I always start with that, when somebody is starting their healing journey. What is it that you're missing the most, and what of that can you actually create? Because it's not about replacing someone, it's what can you create, stepping back into that empowerment, stepping back into making choices that are helping you. And I think that's really beautiful when you have community, because you said you live in a quite unsafe neighborhood. I was so lucky that I live in a super safe neighborhood. We've got this small country town where I live, and our house is on the same driveway with 6 other houses, and we are the ones in the middle. So we're surrounded by neighbors. So I literally felt we were so cradled in. So I can so relate to what Julia must be feeling, when you have neighbors around you that live in such beautiful community. Our community is not as close-knit as yours, but I do have my neighbors, and I know when something happens, I could knock on any door in the middle of the night, it doesn't matter. And that gives you such a feeling of being looked after, being safe. So shout out to my neighbors, if any of them is watching it. I have always felt very looked after, and that makes a huge difference. So Danielle, I just want to thank you really from the bottom of my heart for sharing your story. It has touched me so deeply, and I'm absolutely certain that, particularly with Father's Day coming up, people watching this here, there is a different way of dealing with death, of dealing with, of actively living community. Is there anything that you would like to share before we conclude this interview today? Is there any last shout out that you want to say to people listening to this?
Yeah, look, in many ways, our story is unique. Obviously, we built houses together and we invested in life together. But even within a few years, we realized that you can live in the same house and not do life together. You can certainly live as families side by side and not do life together. And that's where we realized that it was so important to create regular patterns where we would intersect, like eating and praying and having fun together. And those patterns and commitments that we had actually is what created the community, not living side by side. And so I know some of my story may not connect with your story, but I think no matter where you're at in life, you can find someone that you want to create community with and create some patterns. I write about that in my book, predictable patterns to find, even if it's having a coffee once a month.
Predictable patterns.
Once a month, have a coffee with someone. But if you do that for 3 years, I guarantee you'll have a deep relationship with them. And then it does help future-proof you for grief and struggle when life happens, because now that we still meet, we prayed every Thursday morning for years and years, and we still meet. And without Mick, we always miss him, because he would make jokes and he would lighten the mood. But at the same time, we've already set that culture, and so life continues. And then it's supported us to continue connecting and helping each other through this time and celebrating what's been wonderful, and grieving together when things are hard. And I think that's those kind of patterns of eating and other things are really, really important, no matter where you're at in life.
I love all the beautiful C words you're throwing at us: culture, community, celebrating. There's such a beautiful conversation here that we had today. I'm really truly grateful that we finally we're able to share that with our audience here. And I want to thank you for coming, but also for Julia to allow you to share that story, and also your wife. You know, I want you to really please pass on my regards to them, and thank you so much for being here today, Daniel.
Right, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.